In the cold, unforgiving Atlantic of 1942, the sea was not blue. It was black, black with oil, wreckage, and death. Beneath its surface, German U-boats prowled silently, hunting the lifelines of the Allied forces. Every convoy that dared cross the ocean was a moving target. Merchant ships carried food, ammunition, and hope, and the U-boats waited like sharks in the dark. For the sailors on board, the most terrifying sound was silence the moment the ocean went still before a torpedo strike. Ships exploded into flames. Men fell into freezing waters, and the ocean swallowed their screams. Each night, the sea grew heavier with loss. The Battle of the Atlantic had become a slaughter. Every attempt to protect the convoys seemed to fail. Depth charges missed. Sonar couldn't detect in time. The enemy beneath the waves was listening, adapting, always one step ahead. Britain's survival depended on keeping those convoys alive. But against the ears of the U-boats, the deadly sonar systems that could hear a propeller miles away, even silence was not enough. The Atlantic was bleeding, and the Allies were running out of time. As the convoys kept falling, the Admiralty in London turned desperate. Every day brought new reports: another ship lost, another 100 men gone. The U-boats weren't just weapons. They were predators that could hear their prey long before they were seen. Their hydrophones could pick up the low hum of an engine miles away. Even the rhythmic churn of propellers through salt water was enough to give away a convoy's position. Inside the war rooms of Britain, the best scientists and engineers gathered. Acoustics experts, physicists, naval strategists, all searching for one impossible thing: silence. Could an entire fleet move across the ocean without being heard? Could they hide their sound the way camouflage hides a soldier? They tried everything: new propeller shapes, quieter engines, rubber coatings, complex sonar decoys. Each idea was expensive, time-consuming, and half-effective. For every countermeasure the Allies invented, the Germans found a way to beat it. It was a war not of bullets, but of frequencies of echoes bouncing through the deep. And then, far away from London's laboratories, in the noisy belly of a destroyer ship, a man who was not a scientist began to notice something strange. A man whose tools were not microscopes or equations, but pots, knives, and pans. His name was William Nicholas. He was the ship's cook, and he was about to change the course of the Atlantic War. Was not a man of science. He was a cook, a quiet, broad-shouldered man with tired eyes and steady hands, who spent his days surrounded by boiling pots and the smell of salt and smoke. His world was small, the galley of a British destroyer, always vibrating from the engines below. But as he worked, he listened. He listened to the heartbeat of the ship, the constant humming of the propellers, the rhythmic pounding that never stopped, day or night. He noticed something that no one else paid attention to. When oil or grease spilled overboard from his kitchen waste, the sea behind the ship went strangely still. The waves softened, the foam faded, and the churning sound seemed to muffle. He began to wonder, could the layer of oil on the water actually change how sound moved through the sea? Could it be that something as simple as kitchen grease might confuse the U-boat's listening devices? At first, it was just a thought, something half-formed between exhaustion and curiosity. But the more Nicholas noticed it, the more it made sense. He'd seen sonar operators complain when waves were calm, when the sea surface was oily as if the echoes didn't come back right. Maybe, he thought, sound needed a rough surface to bounce from. Maybe a calm, greasy ocean could swallow sound instead of reflecting it. It was an insane idea. A cook thinking about submarine acoustics was laughable. But ideas don't ask permission, they just arrive. And Nicholas, armed with nothing but instinct and curiosity, began to test his theory in secret. Late at night, when the ship was quiet, he collected scraps of oil, leftover soap powder, and bits of rubber from discarded gloves. He mixed them in a bucket until it became a thick, milky foam. As the destroyer sailed through the Atlantic darkness, he poured a small amount over the stern and waited. The change was subtle, almost invisible. But deep below, the sonar operator noticed something impossible. The usual hum of the ship's engines had vanished from the sonar screen. The destroyer had gone silent, as if it had been swallowed by the ocean. William Nicholas had no idea. But in that quiet moment, he had just invented a weapon more powerful than any torpedo, the art of vanishing beneath sound itself. When William Nicholas told the officers about what he'd seen, they laughed. A cook talking about submarine detection was absurd. He was told to focus on soup, not sonar. But Nicholas wasn't looking for glory, he was trying to save lives. He quietly continued his small experiments in secret, mixing different ingredients in the galley at night. Kitchen grease, powdered soap, melted rubber, and bits of wax. Every day, he would pour a small amount into the sea and listen. At first, there was nothing. No visible change, no confirmation. But one night, when the destroyer sailed through unusually calm waters, the sonar operator shouted in confusion. The ship's echo had disappeared. Its acoustic signature, the sound U-boats used to locate them, was gone. The operator thought his system had failed, but Nicholas knew better. He had created a sound curtain, a layer of oily bubbles that absorbed the sonar waves before they could return. The next morning, he told the captain. The captain, skeptical but curious, ordered the test repeated. Again, the ship vanished from sonar detection for several minutes. The men on the deck were stunned. Something in that greasy foam had broken the laws of war at sea. Reports were sent to London. The Admiralty's scientists arrived weeks later, puzzled but intrigued. They recreated Nicholas's experiment in controlled tanks, and the results were identical. The mixture scattered sonar waves, disrupting the U-boat's ability to listen. It was not magic, it was physics, discovered by a man with no degree, only observation and courage. Word spread quietly through the fleet. Some cook figured out how to silence a ship. Nicholas became a rumor. A legend whispered in canteens. The man who mixed soap and grease to blind the hunters beneath the waves. Soon, his strange concoction would become a secret weapon, one that turned the Atlantic from a graveyard into a battlefield of hope. When the destroyer returned to port, the officers filed a short and unusual report. Sound profile vanished under oily surface. Cause unknown. The message reached the Admiralty's research division, where it caused quiet curiosity. Within weeks, a team of naval scientists was sent to investigate, and at the heart of it all stood William Nicholas, the ship's cook, with a strange idea and a nervous smile. The scientists expected a complex formula or an engineering blueprint. Instead, Nicholas pointed to a bucket and said, "That's it." Inside was his thick mixture, part grease, part soap, part luck. When poured into water, it formed a shimmering film that floated over the surface, breaking apart the echoes of sound waves. Sonar, which normally bounced cleanly off the water, now scattered into thousands of tiny directions. To the U-boats below, the surface became noise-confused, blurred, and unreadable. The Admiralty quickly classified the discovery under the name Project Grease Curtain. Chemists refined the mixture, giving it stability in cold water and adding substances that helped it spread evenly. Soon, drums of the strange compound began appearing on convoy ships. Every captain was given a single instruction. If U-boats are near, pour and run. The results were astonishing. Submarines reported that Allied ships disappeared mid-chase. Torpedoes fired into the curtain missed entirely. For the first time in years, the hunters were blind. The ocean, which had been the U-boat's greatest weapon, was now their enemy. Nicholas was not allowed to speak of his creation. He was transferred quietly to a coastal facility, assisting scientists in improving the formula. He never wore a uniform higher than his cooks, never received a medal, but his work spread across the Atlantic like a whisper. A man with no training in physics had given the Allies one of the most effective acoustic shields of the war. And while others fought with bombs and bullets, he fought with grease and silence. By the spring of 1943, drums marked Project Grease Curtain began appearing across Allied convoys. Each barrel held a pale, oily substance that looked harmless, yet it could turn the ocean itself into a weapon of deception. When U-boats were suspected nearby, crews were ordered to release the compound behind the ships. Within minutes, the surface of the Atlantic shimmered with a thin, milky film stretching for miles. The effect was immediate and mysterious. The once clear hum of propellers faded into a dull whisper. Sonar echoes scattered like dust in the wind, breaking apart before they could return to the listening ears of the enemy. To the German operators below, the world above went silent. They called it Das Gespenstmeer, the Ghost Sea. Convoy after convoy began to cross unharmed. Where 10 ships once vanished, now 9 arrived safely. For the first time since the war began, the U-boats were losing their edge. They fired blindly, frustrated, their torpedoes slicing through nothing but empty waves. Some captains thought the Allies had found a new kind of stealth ship. Others believed it was superstition luck or divine intervention. But deep within London's archives, a simple truth was known. The Ghost Sea was born from a cook's experiment with kitchen grease. The scientist who once mocked Nicholas now studied his formula with reverence. They added polymers to make it last longer, substances to spread faster in cold water. What began as an accident of observation had evolved into the first true form of acoustic camouflage, the art of hiding sound beneath silence. As the Atlantic convoys began to glide unseen through enemy waters, Nicholas's strange invention became one of the quiet revolutions of the war. The men who used it didn't know his name, but they blessed the oily trail that followed their ships because every ripple meant survival. By late 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was beginning to change. The hunters, the feared German U-boats, were losing their power. Convoys that once trembled at every sonar ping now moved with a new confidence, shrouded in the strange silence that William Nicholas had given them. Reports from the front were unlike anything seen before. Submarines reported chasing entire fleets that vanished mid-pursuit, their propeller sounds swallowed by the calm sea. Torpedoes missed their marks again and again. To the U-boat commanders, it felt as though the ocean itself had turned against them. In Berlin, frustration grew. Naval engineers tested their sonar systems again, certain they were malfunctioning. But there was nothing wrong with the machines. The ocean had changed, or rather, the way sound moved through it had changed. Messages from the front were short and desperate. Enemy convoys disappear within acoustic fog, impossible to track. No one understood that the fog was made from grease, soap, and the imagination of a ship's cook. For the Allied sailors, hope returned. Each voyage that once felt like a suicide mission now ended with the sight of land on the horizon. They still faced storms, exhaustion, and the ever-present fear of the deep, but now they had something the enemy didn't silence. The silence that meant survival. Statisticians noticed the difference before the public ever heard of it. Convoy losses dropped by nearly 80% in 6 months. Supplies that had once been a trickle now flowed freely into British ports. The balance of power in the Atlantic, that long, bitter struggle for control of the sea lanes, was shifting. And it all began with a man in an apron, a pot of grease, and an impossible idea. When news of the mysterious Sound Curtain reached the Admiralty's headquarters, they summoned the man responsible. William Nicholas arrived in London quietly, wearing his cook's uniform, carrying nothing but a small notebook filled with sketches and stains. He was escorted through long marble corridors into a room filled with scientists, naval officers, and government officials, men who had spent their lives studying warfare and engineering. They expected equations, formulas, or at least technical jargon, but Nicholas spoke simply, with the calmness of a man who had already made peace with being underestimated. He explained how he had noticed the sound of the sea changing when grease spread across the surface, how he had mixed soap powder to make it last longer, and how he had tested it during quiet nights while others slept. At first, they didn't believe him. The idea that a cook could stumble upon what dozens of laboratories had failed to find seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. Sonar recordings, convoy survival statistics, and field tests all pointed to the same conclusion. William Nicholas had changed the physics of the battlefield. For hours, they questioned him. He answered with humility, never once using the word invention. When asked what had driven him to try, he said, "I was tired of hearing the sea scream." His words stunned the room into silence. In that moment, every man present understood this was not luck. It was empathy turned into innovation. Nicholas didn't think like a scientist. He thought like a sailor, a man who had listened to fear echo through the steel of his ship. He was offered a research post, but he declined. He wanted to return to his ship, to cook, to serve the same men he had quietly saved. He left the Admiralty without ceremony, fading back into the ranks of ordinary sailors, while his idea became the Navy's quiet secret. A shield made not from steel, but from soundless courage. When the war finally ended, Britain celebrated its victory with parades, medals, and the sound of peace echoing through its harbors. But amid the cheers, one man's name was missing. There were no headlines about the cook who had silenced the Atlantic, no medals pinned to his chest, no official record of his creation because Project Grease Curtain had been classified, sealed behind the cold walls of military secrecy. William Nicholas returned home quietly, the same way he had lived. He left the sea and opened a small diner near Portsmouth, a humble place filled with laughter, the smell of frying eggs, and old Navy men who never recognized the quiet hero behind the counter. Sometimes, when he wiped the grill clean, he would look at the thin layer of oil shimmering on the metal and smile faintly, as though it whispered a secret only he could hear. Decades passed, and the world moved on. New wars began. New technologies replaced the old. But in the silence of naval museums, in dusty archives buried under layers of classified files, traces of Nicholas's work remained: technical reports with missing signatures, sonar readings that made no sense, and a simple handwritten note in the margin of one file. Cook's formula successful must remain confidential. Few ever knew that one man's imagination had saved thousands of sailors from watery graves. He never sought fame, never asked for reward. He believed that the ocean didn't need more heroes, it needed more listeners. And he had listened better than anyone. The men who once served under him never forgot the strange calmness that followed their ships in those terrible years. To them, it was a miracle. To William Nicholas, it was just an idea born from observation, refined by courage, and carried forward by silence. The sea forgot his name. History forgot his story. But every time a ship moves silently across the water, a part of him still travels with it, unseen, unsung, and eternal. Decades have passed since the guns of World War II went silent. Yet the ocean still remembers the men who listened to it and the one who taught it silence. Modern warships glide across the seas today, wrapped in layers of sonar-resistant coatings, their engines whispering instead of roaring. Submarines dive deeper, stealthier, quieter. Every fragment of that technology, from sound-absorbing polymers to anti-sonar fields, traces its roots to one forgotten discovery born in the galley of a British destroyer. William Nicholas never patented his idea. He never claimed ownership. To him, it was not invention, it was duty. But the quiet wisdom he left behind became the backbone of modern naval stealth. The same principle that turned grease and soap into salvation now defines the most advanced fleets on Earth. In the Royal Navy's archives, his name appears only once: a small note attached to the early documentation of acoustic masking. Original concept: W. Nicholas Cook, HMS Rotherfield. That one line is all that remains in the official record of a man who reshaped the sound of war. Historians now call him the accidental engineer of silence, a man whose courage came not from command, but from curiosity. He taught the world that great ideas are not born only in laboratories or universities, but also in the smallest corners, where observation meets necessity. The sea is a strange teacher. It punishes arrogance, rewards patience, and hides its secrets beneath endless waves. William Nicholas listened to those waves, and in doing so, he gave generations of sailors something no scientist had ever promised them before: the sound of safety. Today, when a destroyer crosses the Atlantic without leaving a trace on enemy sonar, it moves inside the echo of his genius, a ripple of silence stretching across history. He may have died unknown, but every whisper of calm that follows a ship's wake is his signature. And so, the cook who silenced the sea lives on, not in fame, not in books, but in the stillness that guards those who sail beneath the flag he once served.